I want to take the opportunity to also thank the organization, OMLA, 1 Million Leaders in Africa, for this very important platform and discussion of a very central issue, which is, what does it mean to be an African? You see, identity is such a fundamental issue. It is at the core of human existence. It is what makes us human. It is said, I think, therefore I am. And the essential thought is the internal, our sense of who we are. It governs every aspect of our conduct as human beings. You see, identity is two-dimensional. You have your sense of who you are, or in the collective, our sense of who we are, what we think of ourselves. And then you have the other dimension, which is what others see of us, how they see us and perceive each one of us, or in our collective. So those are the two dimensions I want to discuss, because at the root of the two dimensions is a narrative. When we look at the subjective narrative of who we are as Africans, what do we see? Honestly speaking, what do we see? We are a happy people. We are a peaceful people. And we are a contented people. Those are what I see as the three elements of the true African identity, subjectively speaking. Anybody looking at us will see those elements. Happy, peaceful, contented. But then let's explore the external narrative, how we are portrayed. What are we told? What do the history books tell us about the African, who we are? Uncivilized, ungodly, uneducated, poor, and wretched. That is the external narrative of the African, how we are seen, how we are portrayed. Now, I want to explore those narratives more closely today. And at this point, I would like to share my screen, if at all possible. Yes.
Yes, please go ahead. Okay, good.
So I'm going to explain this with reference to two books. One is represents the external narrative. That is the dual mandate in British tropical Africa by a gentleman called Lord Lugard. He was a critical player in the British colonial experiments and construct across Africa. He started in Uganda and he ended up in Nigeria. And he wrote the book, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa. And inside that book, you will see some descriptions of how we were perceived as a people. Juxtapose against that our narrative. This is my latest book, A Slave Ship Called Jesus, which was digging to the roots of the beginning of the interaction between the European and the African, And you see some of the evidence that comes through in that book. Let me see if I can move to the first quotation from Lugard's The Dual Mandate. See what he said here about the Igbo race. The great Igbo race to the east of the Niger, numbering some 3 million, and their cognate tribes, had not developed beyond the stage of primitive savagery. Primitive savagery. You see the portrayal of a people who were peaceful, contented, and happy. Primitive savagery. That narrative was necessary because it was on the basis of such a narrative that the agenda, the colonial conquistador agenda, had to rest. Colonialism had to be justified. And so what was required if these people were primitive and savage? And by the way, we speak of, I just use this as an example because the narrative was the same right across Africa. So what did they need? According to Lugard and Co., they needed civilization. They needed Christianity. And that was to be delivered through colonization. He expands on this even more. He says, it was the task of civilization to put an end to slavery, to establish courts of law, to inculcate in the natives a sense of individual responsibility, of liberty and of justice, and to teach their rulers how to apply these principles. Above all, to see to it that the system of education should be such as to produce happiness and progress. But these were a happy and progressive and peaceful peoples. The task of civilization to put an end to slavery, which the Europeans industrialized and commercialized, to establish courts of law, to inculcate in the natives a sense of individual responsibility. Africans had their, inverted commas, judicial systems. You go to any village and disputes are resolved, as in the court of law. They do not wear wigs and gowns, but the jurisprudence is there because it is there in every society, in every community of humans, how disputes are resolved. So what does this narrative lead to, the Lugard narrative of what it is to be an African? It led to self-loathing amongst the people, those who imbibed this narrative. It led to submission, a sense of inferiority, an acceptance of everything that the Lugardists brought in. And ultimately, and a corollary of that, it led to racism, because that sense of superiority and inferiority is at the bedrock of racism. Lugard went on to talk about how European connection with Africa and the educational and religious influence that came through. And he identified something he called the Europeanized African. And here's his description of the Europeanized African. Europeanized Africans represent no tribal community, but form a class apart in the principal cities of the West Coast, where they reside in a varying minority among an illiterate population in a tribal stage of development, amid sordid surroundings for men of education and culture. They may belong to one or other of the neighboring tribes and speak their language, or they may, as in Sierra Leone, be the descendants of liberated slaves, ignorant of any African languages. individuals complete their education in England and return as ministers of religion, barristers, doctors, and journalists. The Europeanized African is indeed separated from the rest of the people by a gulf which no racial affinity can bridge. He must be treated, and seems to desire to be treated, as though he were of a different race. But what if the narrative was wrong? What if the African before the colonial intrusion were indeed godly, peaceful, and prosperous? Now, let's look at this evidence. This is one of the points that I quote in the new book. It is not written by us. This is James Anthony Froude, one of the leading historians of England. And I quote him in the new book, A Slave Ship Called Jesus. Look at this evidence. The European voyagers, when they first visited the coast of Western Africa, found there, for the most part, a quiet, peaceable, and contented people, basking in the sunshine, in harmless idleness. We'll forgive him that. Unprovoked to make war upon one another, because they had nothing to desire, and receiving strangers with the unsuspecting trustfulness which is observed in the birds and animals of new countries, when for the first time they come in contact with man. So there is the evidence, objective evidence. We didn't write it. This is what was actually observed, but it is not what is taught, and it's not what is written in the mainstream history books. You know, the narrative there is that we were always killing ourselves. But for what? In a land of plenty? In paradise? Murder in paradise? How does that happen? There's further evidence. This was in the course of the abolition debates in Parliament. This was a British Prime Minister, Charles Fox. Again, I quote him in a new book. Here's the true narrative behind the false narrative about Africans killing themselves and selling themselves into slavery. We encouraged wars for the sake of taking not men's goods and possessions, but men themselves. And it was not the war which was the cause of the slave trade, but the slave trade which was the cause of the war. So what if colonization was not bringing civilization to the uncivilized, but barbarism to the civilized? You see, what happened was that the lowest amongst every society produces winners and losers. And in the African societies as they were, peaceful, contented, there were losers. And those losers and strugglers were the ones that the Lugard's homed in upon in order to uproot the social orders and political orders that we had, in order to implant their colonial project. And what if we view colonization in its true light, which was ably explained by the late, great Harold Smith? In his unpublished memoirs, they would not allow those memoirs to be published, because there he told the true story of the African. But what he said was this. He said colonization is the stealing of another man's country. So stripped of the wonderful narrative, the perfume of the history books written in Europe, about the civilizing mission of colonization. It was the stealing of another man's country. It brought warfare, death, and destruction. We Africans had no record of colonizing any other peoples. How then do we begin to see what it means to be an African in that context? If colonization is the stealing of another man's country, with all the antecedents and the consequences of deception, of casual murder and pillaging, how does the African identity now look? What if we see the Berlin Conference in its true light? When you see those images of the great and the good of Europe sat around that table in Berlin, a feast of cannibalism. Because what is cannibalism? The narrative that was run about Africans in the land of plenty with animals teeming all over the place, the false narrative was sold to justify colonization, that these people are eating themselves. In paradise, how does that work? What happened to the urge to eat another human being, if it was true? But what if the true cannibalism was those sitting around that table? And if you visualize Africa as a big, let's call it a wildebeest, and the lions are sitting there saying, I'll have the leg, I'll have a slice of the breast, I'll have the head. And they're painting it in all those colors that we see in the maps of Africa. A feast of cannibals. And what about industrialization? How do we see that in its true lights? Is it not simply the harvest of death and destruction of others? Because it is when the mind is free from struggle for everyday existence and survival that the surplus then releases the creative capacity that all human beings have. So in the light of this changed narrative, what does it mean to be an African? I say the African has been the victim of the greatest defamation of character that has ever been known to man. That is the greatest crime committed against Africa, the defamation of our character with lethal consequences. But a new African has weathered a storm, and we're now telling our own story. COVID has reset the stage. That's I believe will become really manifest in the years to come. The old African didn't know the history. The new African does. This is a new narrative that platforms like OMLA are helping to push, a new narrative about who the African really is. There's a war out there. It has just begun. It is a history war. It's a war about the history, the true history of Africa. Between those who will tell the true story and those who will continue to peddle and run the old story full of its distortions and its narrative with that agenda of consuming the resources of other peoples and stealing their lands. And just like the Black Lives Matters movement and the George Floyd crisis. It is not just between Africans and non-Africans. There are Africans and non-Africans on both sides of this new war. There are Africans who will still continue to peddle the false narrative and the false history in alliance with those who continue and desire to continue to steal the resources of others. But they're now up against a new alliance of Africans and non-Africans who want to get the true story of Africa across, the real identity of the African. I want to thank this organization, 1 Million Leaders in Africa, and Peter David in particular, for spearheading this. It's a great new war that's beginning. And this one, Africans are not going to lose it. With that, I'll hand you back to our Chairman Lawrence.